everyone. Welcome to Let's Deconstruct a Story. I am Kelly Forden, and I'm here today with Rion Amilcar Scott, and we are going to be talking about his story, Shape Up at Delilah's, which was first published in The New Yorker in 2019. Welcome, Rion.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this story. This is our first live recording, and we'll probably have some glitches, but it's very exciting to have other people in the room. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask questions for about 25 minutes and then open it up to the discussion. And hopefully some of the discussion will also be in this recording. Before we start, I just wanted to thank the Grosse Pointe Public Library in Michigan, which gave 10 copies of The World Doesn't Require You to the first 10 people who signed up for this. And Pages Bookshop also has many copies of the book. So if you could support Pages Bookshop in Detroit, we would greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I will get to the story. I just wanted to ask a couple questions about Cross River as a location. I know that it's not only in this story, but it's in many of your other stories. So could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Cross River, that's I call it my fictional homeland. That's a town that just about pretty much all my stories take place in. Or if it doesn't take place in Cross River, there's some connection to Cross River, and it has a fictional history in that it was founded after a successful slave revolt in Virginia, and the people migrated to Maryland after the slave revolt and founded this town. And it was founded in 1807. And within the story and in real life, the whole idea was inspired by the Haitian Revolution, which was a successful slave revolt in the late 1700s. So in the story world, they were inspired by the Haitian Revolution, and in my writing life, that's kind of what sparked that idea as well.
And this story in particular, in this series of stories you've written about that take place in Cross River, when was this story in particular written? Was it one of the first ones you wrote?
No, not by any means. So my first book also takes place in Cross River, and that came out in 2016. And in that book, there's a story called Razor Bumps about a great hair crisis in which barbers in Cross River lose the ability to cut hair well. And so this is a continuation of that story of the crisis. So this is the ending of the crisis. So it was written, I guess. The World Doesn't Require You came out in 2019. So I guess I wrote it in 2018, 2017.
Yeah, I was wondering because so this story is not in The World Doesn't Require You, and I had read the other one as well. Why isn't this one in The World Doesn't Require You? This story? Yeah,
it just wasn't ready, and I had two stories. So I had to cut a bunch of stories. I had to cut 2 or 3 stories. One I cut, and it just wasn't really any good. So I was happy to cut that one. Then there was another one again needed more work. And this one just couldn't get it right until I went to a workshop called Kimbilio, and the writer Jacinda Townsend was a teacher and in charge of that workshop, and she gave me some very crucial advice. I had 2 characters, and she said, there's no need for these 2 characters here. You should combine them into one. The main character's ex-boyfriend had a brother, and there was just no need for the brother and the ex-boyfriend. So once I figured that out, once she said that just opened up the whole story for me.
So the ex-boyfriend's brother, was that Jerome's brother that we see in this story, but he's not like really in the story anymore?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He was a really big part of the story before. And so just at a certain point, I just combined them.
I was thinking sometimes I like when I'm trying to figure out who has, the stage in the story or whatever I do, it's sort of a nerdy thing, but I write down how many times like someone's, name was mentioned in the story. And this isn't totally accurate, but so like Tiny is 122 times. I'm sure that's off because I'm terrible at math, but somewhere around that. And then like Jerome is like 68 times, and Cross River's mentioned just 6 times, which is interesting. But the story itself is 7,500 words roundabout, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking like, well, it's a two-part question. One, did you always know that Tiny, was going to be like sort of the focal point of the story? It was her story. And then secondly, about the length of the story, as short story writers, we're always told, oh, like, that's too long. That's too long. But this is a really full-bodied story that feels more like a novel to me.
Mm. Yeah. I always knew Tiny was going to be the focal point of the story. See, the whole idea, it came from just the idea when I was growing up. The black barbershops are, for a lot of black men, it's a big part of our lives. Every 2 weeks, or in my brother's case, every week, is at the barbershop, and it becomes this place where there's a lot of shit talking going on, a lot of a lot of ideas bandied back and forth. Sometimes startlingly ridiculous ideas, startlingly horrible ideas, sometimes startlingly brilliant ideas. And when I was growing up, there's just this idea in the air in the black barbershops amongst black men that this was our space, and that women, as black men, that women, didn't really have a place in it, and especially not as barbers. It was the idea that women couldn't cut hair, and it was just this like kind of mythical thing. And it was kind of like this idea that someone tells you something when you're 3, and there's no challenge, no pushback. You just kind of roll with it and believe it, And I started thinking back to that as an adult, and was like, that's such a ridiculous thing. And at the time I started it, I was the barbershop that I went to. The best person in there was a woman, and she was holding her own amongst the men. And I was, every time I would sit down and think, like, how these ideas just keep going, just go unchallenged. So I wrote it to sort of challenge those ideas that we get as preconceived notions. And they just perpetuate themselves.
Yeah, like there were so many different themes in the story, power imbalances, gender, racism, and then the secrets. And then I was really fascinated with the superstitions and beliefs that people have, just thinking about gender, so much happening in the world this past week with gender, and how, like, if a woman, she has this power, she has this capability, and the minute that she's able to use it, everybody's saying, like, where'd that come from? How's that possible? It just felt like a metaphor for so much more than just hair cutting, basically.
Yeah, it's not it's funny because it's not a mystery. She studied, and she had some ability, and she worked upon it. But to the men in the story, there had to be some kind of trickery, some sort of witchcraft, and so yeah, and I really sort of kind of fused that with it really always made me think of the story of Samson and Delilah, and so I sort of fused that, weave that into the story a little bit.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the naming of her. First, she's Tiny, she's Abby, she's Delilah, and she tells that great story about when she was young, and and she was first called Tiny, and people used her name. And I was just curious, since we have you here, like, I have my ideas about how her name was used, not against her, but you know what I mean, maybe against her. I'm just wondering how you explored that notion of naming, the power of the name.
It happens a lot with my characters, that they have multiple names, and their names evolve throughout the stories. That's something that usually when I write it, I'm not focusing, I'm not trying to do, but then I notice that it's on the page, so then I sort of mess with that a little bit. I'm not sure where Tiny came from, but I think the idea, is the idea of people attempting to diminish her, and diminishment, and her taking that on and then transforming that into her own thing. Just as the name Delilah started as an insult, and she transforms that into, yeah, that's gonna be my identity then. And I'll be Delilah if that's what you want me to be.
Yeah, and there's so much power in that. I love that about her. And another thing that got me was, when she finally realizes, like, Jerome asks Reverend Timothy to come, and he acts like that's a good thing at first. But then, then he starts giving away her secrets about, the fake secrets about the lie and everything else. Uh-huh. And I was thinking about how, and she doesn't like react in any overt way, but I was thinking about just the devastation of being betrayed in that way. That she was giving so much of herself, and she kept giving more than she wanted to give. She kept going above and beyond, I think, like giving the haircuts when she didn't want to keep giving the haircuts to people. And it did seem to come from a place of love. Maybe I'm reading all this into it, but that's how it felt. And then he betrays her. And I was just wondering about his motivations. What do you think? Was he just threatened by her, or what was going on there?
I think that there's something to that of being threatened, but also I think there's the idea of the binary and being on a team, right? And he's, he feels that he has to be on team men, right? When there really is no team and there really is no game, there really is no battle, but, he sort of feels that he has to be, his whole sympathetic air, it was really him being a spy and him attempting to gain her secrets so that he can tell other men, all right? And he can be a hero to men everywhere, men all over Cross River. With Tiny here, she's ending this plague, this great hair crisis, right? She has the ability to end it. Her and her team of barbers, but they won't let her. As much as this thing has been, a thorn on the heads of everybody in Cross River, they won't let her end it just because I feel like it's sort of like the idea of a woman doing it. It's something that's really too hard for them to take. Yeah,
it just felt like, they were on the precipice of this great moment where it was all going to end. The great hair crisis was going to be over. And then, but then you have that at the very end, that last paragraph gives some hope that, even though she's gone and it's not over, that maybe the next generations, is that what you were hoping to give, like a little bit of hope at the end? The next generations will conquer.
I had a professor who said that, within a story, there's no matter what, there's always hope because the story is written, if you're writing a story, then you're feeling like there's, that it can do something, even if it's the bleakest story in the world. So yeah, there's I guess there is hope in there. And, I kind of feel like, it's every generation in life, every generation, finds new ideas and the older generation is sort of scandalized by it. Or we accept it, and I think as I grow older and I look at the younger generations, they have very different ideas than I grew up with, and sometimes it's you get to sit down and be schooled at times, and I sometimes I wonder what older generations are going to look back on. Future generations are going to look back at us and say, man, I can't believe that's the way they lived and that's what they believe. So I think as a passage of time, there's always hope.
Yeah, I agree. It was a great way to end it. And okay, one last editing question, and then I'll open it up to everybody else. Obviously, went through an editing process with the New Yorker. But was this like I'm curious about, since this is for short story writers, curious about just the process of editing there and before there. Was there anything besides just the brother that was in there before, or did she have any suggestions? They're not too concerned about length of stories like other literary magazines. I mean, there's so much. Not. Yeah.
That part that you talked about where Tiny's cutting hair and the guy kind of forces her to cut the hair. And then she talks about her background. That was suggested by my agent. And I went back and I put that, and I thought that was a really good suggestion. And then the editor at the New Yorker tried to take that out, but I don't remember how it got back in, but the story didn't. I don't think the story worked as well without it. I thought that moment was really important for her to talk about who she is and how she came to be. So that went back in.
That was one of my favorite parts. I'm really surprised that she tries to.
Part. I kind of pushed back on them taking it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, I thought it was awesome. Yeah, it makes her so understandable. And did this? I know I said I was asking the last question, but one last question. Was it hard to write from a woman's perspective, or or to know how to think about how she might feel in those situations?
Yeah, before I wrote my first book, a long time before I wrote my first book, I used to have a lot of difficulty writing from a woman's perspective. And then I wrote this story. This is my first book called 202 Checkmates. And that really taught me, not just how to write from perspective outside of myself. You really have to, start with the core of humanity, and then think about how things are different as people navigate through the world. So I didn't necessarily find it difficult because, I just started thinking of Tiny, as, what matters to her, and then, and how, in this situation, what would matter to me, and then how would it be different with this sort of difference, attached. So it's not, so I don't really find it that difficult anymore.
Yeah, I like that part about you just find the core of the humanity and what it would feel, and then empathize or try to. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm going to unmute everybody here and see if we have any questions. You can tell me in the chat if you have a question. If you'd rather put one in the chat, we can do it that way.
I'm curious. I love the short story form, so I'm really curious how people approach it. And do you plot out like your characters and maybe the arc of the story in advance, or do you kind of learn that through the writing process as you go?
Yeah, it has to be. To me, it has to be learning as I go. That's the fun part for me. That's sort of the exploration. To me, it's not any fun to have everything worked out. I like the act of discovery. So I kind of start with a character, and maybe put them with another character, and then something happens, and it's sort of magic, but something is always going to happen when you put two characters together.
It's way more fun that way. I totally agree.
Yeah.
It can be tempting. I feel like in workshop, a lot of times, I don't know, there's always this, at least the feedback I've gotten is like to write it in scenes and think of it as like a 3-act play or something. Like I've gotten that advice before, like to at least get sort of the architecture of the story on the page, which I guess I can live with that as like a happy medium, but I love the exploration, like you said.
Yeah. And when I write, I don't necessarily write in drafts too much. I sort of, I write and then I come back the next day and I start and I read it over from the beginning and I sort of go line by line, sentence by sentence, until I get to the new material. And that really changes how the story evolves.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Oh, that was my question too, really. But turning to this story, so the structure where you start off with the love story that doesn't work out, and then you go to the hair crisis, and then she starts the barber shop, and then the boyfriend comes back and he doesn't, and he tries to get the secret and she doesn't, and then he betrays her. So most of that came to you in the writing. How much of that structure did you have, if you can even remember?
Yeah, that all came in the writing. That all came in the writing. Yeah, it's a real odd structure. I'll admit. I think if I plotted it out, it might have been more. It might have been more traditional, more conservative. But yeah, that all came.
But that's something I love about this story, that it works and it is such an odd structure. That's almost why I asked, because it's a very tricky story to sit down and sit through. Have you ever read a story by James Alec McPherson called The Faithful? It's in a book elbow room, and it's about a barber shop.
It's on my list. I hear a lot of good things about him, but I haven't read anything by him.
Oh, you should check that out. It's a black barbershop story.
You said it's called The Faithful?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to check it out.
Thank you.
That sounds good. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yes. Hi, Julie.
You said that all of your stories take place in this fictional town.
Yep.
And I'm curious, do you see yourself ever leaving that town? Do you have other... I'm curious because I think I sometimes, as a writer, I worry about getting labeled as a Midwestern writer or a certain kind of writer. And all of my stories in my book sort of take place in Indiana. And I'm just curious about, like, how do you look at that? Do you just think you'll just write those stories until another spark comes to you? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I feel like I'm always going to be there. It's something that I'm working out, the thing about it is it feels, it feels very real and alive to me, and it's always evolving. And I think maybe like 10 years ago, I felt a certain way about it, but the way I feel about it now, it just feels I can see it even more, and I'm so interested in how I'm gonna and how how real it's gonna feel in another 10 years. It's I just love the way it evolves, and it's just a mental real estate that I'm just gonna keep seeing seeing my growth in it.
That's just fascinating. Thank you.
I think it was before you'd written the second book, or, The World Doesn't Require You. And you were saying that you saw it as it was going to take on magical realism more in the second book.
Yeah, I really like being in this weird space where anything can happen, where robots can come in and sit down and have coffee with you, and it's just normal. And I think that's a space that I really like operating in. My first book, I love it and everything. But I remember my favorite review of it is actually a mixed review, and the guy was saying, for as wild as the idea is, these stories seem very tame, and I remember reading it thinking, oh, wait till you see the next book. I think it's I'm always going to be in this sort of liminal space.
I could keep going, but I want to make sure that other people have a chance. If anyone has a question, feel free to jump in.
This is Cynthia.
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for talking with us about your short story. It's really thrilling to hear this background. I wanted to ask you a question about foreshadowing. I feel like in your writing, there's so much foreshadowing. One of the points early on where you talk about she only wanted to cut boy styles seemed to just open up so much for me as the story then unfolded. And I wondered, when you're writing, does that come to you naturally? Do you write your story and then go back and plot little hints along the way? Or how does that come about for you?
That's a good question. I think it comes about in different ways. I think the most fun way it comes about is when you're writing something and then you notice the connections. You notice a certain word or a certain phrase. Will open up something, and you didn't plan it, but it's there, and your sort of your subconscious planted it there, and then you have to go and open that up a little bit more. So, and I guess a lot of times, I think when you get to the end of it and you go back and you reread it, you sort of have to go back and plant little connections. And I can't think of any specific ones for this story. When you mentioned the boy styles, I can't think of where that came from. But a lot of times it's there in the draft, and you sort of have to interrogate yourself and say to yourself, where did you come up with this connection? So let me expand it.
Yeah, like I wanted to ask you about a couple, specific moments. So right in the beginning, when Jerome comes in and then Tiny imagines slicing her finger while sliding it across the front of his head. Her imagined self then smeared the blood all over Jerome's face. And I thought, okay, like, is she angry there? Is she, what was that? What was she feeling in that moment? I wasn't quite sure.
I think you're in a very vulnerable position when you're in that seat. And there's trust, and a lot of times you're trusting someone that's that's practically a stranger to you, and then there's a weird intimacy, especially when you've been going to the same barber for years and years and years, and they know the contours of your head, and there's strange intimacy. So there's that. So there's that moment of power, and then there's that the acknowledgement of the intimate nature of the act of haircutting.
And it almost becomes like an art form for her. I mean, because she says, she starts cutting hair on a whim, and then she begins to choose her lovers partly based partly on the shape of their heads, what styles she could carve on their domes. When their heads no longer intrigued her, she would lose interest. And I thought it is kind of like art.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah. And being that she's one of the only ones that can do it at this level, I think it becomes, it becomes even more of a point of pride. Just as writing a great sentence for a lot of writers is that point of pride. So yeah, it can be an art. She's creating beauty in the world.
Well, yeah, that I wanted to ask about the great hair crisis, because it's like a curse on Cross River. A shop opens and one owner dies of a heart attack, then two barbers murder each other. Another's hair cutting van flips. Always men, driven from the business and in some cases from this world through some misfortune. It felt like a metaphor for something larger, but very subtle if it is. But I also thought it, and this is just personal from being a writer, like when the world is just, something shuts down. I don't know if you meant it as a metaphor or not, but I'm just saying sometimes it's hard to create beauty in the world when you've been traumatized by the world. And so I'm reading into it because I've been traumatized by stuff in the world.
Yeah, we all have. I don't know if I meant that as a metaphor. I mean, if you want it to be a metaphor, there's a lot of things,
Yeah, you can read into it, but since we have you here, I thought, did you mean that?
I mean, the other beautiful thing about stories is that, people find things in it, what they need to find in it. And it may not be necessarily what the author intended. I thoroughly believe readers are way more intelligent at interpreting my stories than I am.
So what did you mean by it?
I'm trying to think of how I invented the Great Hair Crisis. This was a while ago. It's a great device, It
is a great, and it also feels like the way that people explain it is the way they explain so many other things that go wrong with the world. Like it's the curse, or it's the witches, or it's, this or that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, I think a lot of times, if you go to a barber long enough, you'll see their skills decline over time. And I probably was thinking about that, some barbers that I went to, and that, you have this friendship with them, you spent a great deal of time with them, but, and it feels bad to have to just stop going.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it's over.
Yeah. And
sadly.
Yeah. And you can't just switch to another barber in the same shop. You have to go to a whole different shop.
Right. And hope you never run into them again.
Right.
Well, are there any writers that because probably most people who are tuning into this are writers. Are there any writers that you usually turn to for inspiration, or that you greatly admire that you think other short story writers should read?
There are a lot of them. A lot of comes. Nafissa Thompson Spires comes to mind. A great short story writer. Jamel Brinkley, Nana Kwame Adeji Brenya. These are all people put out collections recently that I've sort of been blown away by. In terms of turning for inspiration, I reread Toni Morrison a lot. Randall Keenan, he also had his town that he invented. So he has some really beautiful stories.
I think it's like a great dream of writers to have a place like Cross River where it's just endlessly inspiring for more work. Like Marilyn Robinson, it took her like 27 years or however long to go from from housekeeping to Gilead. And then once she had Gilead, she had this town in Iowa, and then there were 4 books all of a sudden. It feels like a great gift. Does it feel like that to you? Like every time you start working, you get to go back there and you have this whole other world.
It does. It's just a place that I feel like I can take refuge in, a lot, which is a strange thing to say because a lot of really bad things happen in Cross River, but just making that up, inventing things, and it just feels like a,
like
kind of Yeah, it feels like a real place. It does. I think of certain places in Cross River, like Angela Street. It feels like I've been there.
That's so cool. That's so cool. You'll probably be on here though. And someone said Elizabeth Stroud is one of their favorite people too. She's really great too. Oh, and everyone's saying thank you, Rion. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for coming and reading the story.